Hello and welcome to Shades of Murder. In this podcast, I share and discuss tales of true crime from around the world and throughout history, discussing its many layers. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case and may not be intended for all audiences. Also, please note I am not a licensed psychologist or psychiatrist or therapist, but I have done an extensive amount of research for the show, and I have a degree in criminal justice and criminology. Many infamous serial killers have become household names over the years, of which the vast majority are white males. Female serial killers are commonly ignored in true crime and the media at large, even though the number of victims they have garnered often exceeds the average count of male serial killers. I find this lack of interest and coverage to be very bizarre. Can this be explained by our society's continuous quest and desire to place women into the boxes of wives, mothers, and caretakers? I think it certainly plays an integral role in why female serial killers receive such little attention in comparison to their male counterparts. When women fail to meet societal expectations and fulfill the role of nurturer, they have been historically viewed and treated as outcasts. You could say that to some extent, women are still treated like this today. However, females who commit serial murder are not a new phenomenon and have existed as long as male serial killers, perhaps even longer. Women who murder out of the sheer desire for power and control have existed for centuries. Some women murder for sexual deviance or pleasure all of their own. It is not a prerequisite for men to be involved in their crimes. It is also not mandated that a woman's vile actions be triggered by the severe violence and abuse they have suffered, although many have. Sometimes women kill simply because they can, and they enjoy it immensely. This is a story of Boston's Jane Toppan, lovingly referred by her patients as Jolly Jane. Somewhere between the years of 1854 and 1857, Jane Toppan was born Honora A. Kelly, the youngest of the daughters of Peter Kelly and Bridget Finn. The records conflict as to the exact year of her birth. What is known is that Honora lost her mother to tuberculosis when she was a young girl. Her father was nicknamed Kelly the Crack, referring to his being a crackpot, a drunk, and a crazy person who was not capable of taking care of Honora or her other two sisters, Ellen and Delia. There was even a wild rumor that he was a tailor who, during one of his manic and drunk episodes, attempted to sew his eyelids shut. Records show that in February of 1863, Mr. Kelly went to the Boston Female Asylum to admit his daughters. This may sound strange, but at the time this is where young females who were unwanted by their parents or guardians were abandoned. I can only imagine what little Honora endured and was exposed to during her time there. From what we know of institutions at that time in history, it was likely not the most pleasant or comforting of environments, especially for a small child. Less than 2 years after she had been dropped off there, a widower named Mrs. Anna C. Toppan asked the board at the Boston Female Asylum if she could adopt Honora. She was handed over to Mrs. Toppan as an indentured servant when she was barely 6 years old. By 1865, Honora was renamed Jane Jenny Toppan. She was never officially adopted by the Toppan family, and all records indicate that she was more of a servant than a daughter. She lived with Mrs. Toppan and her foster sister Elizabeth, who became a true friend to Jane. The public schools she attended noted how intelligent Jane was and how quickly she learned new things. At this time, there was a negative association with her being from Ireland. It is believed that a story about her background was made up by Mrs. Toppan, which involved both of her parents dying during their voyage from Italy. This first little lie Jane was forced to tell helped to perpetuate a long list of lies and stories Jane would tell others. She would become known for fabricating stories and for unpleasant, gossipy nature. When Jane turned 18, Mrs. Toppan gifted her $50, equivalent to roughly $1,360 in value today, along with words of encouragement to find her place in the world. Jane refused to leave, though, and she stayed at Mrs. Toppan's home until she was 25. There were very few options for women in the workforce at this time. Needless to say, since women did not receive the right to vote until 1920, women who were not married off to take care of a home, children, and their husband were faced with few viable opportunities. Young women, especially those from a struggling background like Jane's, had little chance of making it on their own. Options were limited, and domestic work and nursing were the main industries for women to be employed in. In the late 1880s, Jane Toppan began pursuing a career in nursing. Jane Toppan was highly skilled as a nurse, and her patients loved her jovial demeanor. They adorningly called her Jolly Jane. However, many of her fellow employees did not appreciate her attitude and strong tendencies toward being a liar and an eccentric storyteller at the hospitals where she worked. She was employed at Cambridge Hospital and later at Massachusetts General Hospital, but was let go. She then returned to Cambridge Hospital, but she was also dismissed shortly after. Her co-workers reported that they were concerned by her, and I quote, her unfounded and absurd, suspicious, tale-bearing, slanderous gossip and consequent mischief-making, as well as her pleasure in inventing fabulous tales. Jane Toppan was a known troublemaker. She enjoyed creating problems and loved causing drama and conflict. Various sources also spoke of her propensity to lie about the patients. Jane Toppan reported inaccurate information, transferred patients to other institutions, and even prolonged the illness of some of her patients because she made up symptoms they never had. It was also recorded that Jane was a bit of a klepto. She stole everything from stationery, aprons, and uniforms to sums of money. However, her friends at the hospital spoke so highly of her that no evidence of her theft was ever reported. Jane Toppan was also known to have experimented on patients with morphine and atropine during her residencies at the hospital. She did not follow drug protocols and even administered higher doses than what was prescribed. Jane Toppan shared with many people she worked with that she didn't like old people and that she saw no point in their staying alive. She also frequently inquired about different kinds of poison and their antidotes. There were also rumors at this time that Jane was purposely poisoning patients to the edge of them dying and then bringing them back from the brink and doing it all over again. One patient who experienced this reported that while they were in bed dying, they remembered Nurse Jane crawling into bed with them. When another nurse walked by the room, Jane quickly climbed out. It was suspected then, and after her crimes were discovered, that Jane may have had a taste for opium. Her mishandling of opiates, giving patients incorrect drug dosages, and her bizarre conduct are what ultimately led to Jane losing her job at both hospitals. Her strange and immoral behavior prevented her from finishing the nurse training program. There was no real concern for Jane Toppan, though, because she would make a name for herself when she entered the world of private nursing. In this world, Jane Toppan excelled. She was known for being warm and trustworthy with her patients, and their loved ones appreciated her. Highly experienced and respected physicians recommended Jane to families who needed assistance with their sick and elderly. Even in this private domain of nursing, though, Jane could not help herself, and she took things that did not belong to her. She stole things from her clients. She never paid back the money she borrowed from others. And even though some of these issues were known to the families, many believed that Jane Toppan was a highly skilled and kind nurse. Little did they know that Jane's incessantly greedy and deceitful nature had left their most vulnerable loved ones open to becoming one of Jane's next victims. Jane Toppan was known for dosing her victims with morphine, atropine, and strychnine, Typically, she gave the morphine with a fatal dose of atropine in Hunyadi water, which was generally accepted by both patients and doctors alike. The bitterness of the poisons was covered by the Hunyadi water, which was used as a curative. Jane Toppan could have successfully concealed being a serial killer for decades, but her emotionally triggered murders led her to being discovered. It all began with the murder of Mrs. Alden P. Davis, whom she owed a hefty debt to. Jane had spent a summer at Mrs. Davis's place in Katimet, but had neglected to pay any of her rent. One day, Mrs. Davis decided it was time to collect on Jane's debt. Even though Mrs. Davis injured herself hurrying down a flight of stairs to confront Jane in Cambridge, she insisted on still going to see her. When she arrived to see Jane Toppan, she collapsed to the floor. Jane was more than happy to nurse her back to health, but within 2 days of being in her care, Mrs. Davis died. She traveled back to Katimet with the body of Mrs. Davis, eager to show her support and commiserate with the family in their grief. Jane Toppan stayed with the now widowed Mr. Davis and his 2 married daughters, Mrs. Genevieve Davis Gordon and Mrs. Mary Davis Gibbs. Jane decided to stay there for a couple extra weeks to help sort out affairs and support the family in any way she could. By the end of those weeks that Jane had remained at Katimet, Mr. Davis and his 2 daughters had mysteriously died. It was believed that Jane Toppan had desired Mr. Davis for herself and hoped to woo him into becoming the new Mrs. But when that plan failed, she decided to kill the entire family. The youngest daughter, Mary, was said to be in good health before she suddenly died. Her husband, Captain Gibbs, was away at sea when his wife, sister-in-law, and father-in-law all met untimely deaths. Their deaths were seen as tragic, but not anything of a suspicious or malignant nature. That is until Captain Gibbs returned home from duty and began probing into the circumstances of the sudden deaths of his wife and her family. He found it bizarre and suspicious that Jane Toppan was the only person living in the house who escaped any illness. Captain Gibbs would not accept being ignored, and he eventually got the police to listen to his concerns regarding Jane's possible involvement in his family's deaths. The investigations revealed that one day in July, Jane made a call to the local pharmacy and requested the strongest morphine tablets possible. She instructed the pharmacist to enclose them in paper and deliver them directly to her at Katimet. The pharmacist later acknowledged during the investigation that the amount of morphine Jane had ordered was enough to kill, and I quote, "a score of people." The bottle of deadly pills was ordered, bought, and received by Jane Toppan. The bodies of Mr. Davis and his 2 daughters would next be exhumed. The pathologist would reveal upon examination that all 3 had been poisoned. During this same period, Jane Toppan returned to Lowell to win over her brother-in-law, Deacon Ormel A. Brigham, who was now a widow. Within a few days of her arrival, his sister Edna Bannister became suddenly ill and died of a heart attack. Now Jane had Mr. Brigham all to herself. Similar to her patients at the hospital, it was believed that Jane intentionally poisoned Mr. Brigham so she could personally nurse him back to health. Mr. Brigham became frustrated and fed up with Jane's presence and how everything had gone wrong since her arrival. By the end of September 1901, Mr. Brigham requested that Jane leave his house. Jane Toppan was heartbroken. She felt betrayed and abandoned again, and this time, instead of harming Mr. Brigham, she projected her rage toward herself. Jane attempted to commit suicide by overdosing herself with morphine. She was sent to Lowell General Hospital as a result. While she was there, she tried to kill herself again. Everything began to pile up around Jane, and the mysterious deaths and strange happenings surrounding her were not going unnoticed. Investigators were watching her every move. One detective even went undercover as a patient at the hospital where Jane was admitted. Once released, Jane visited some friends in Amherst, New Hampshire. While she was there, homicide detectives decided they had enough to arrest her. Jane Toppan was arrested on October 29, 1901. She did not seem at all worried about her fate. It was reported that while she awaited her trial in jail, she was in better physical health than she was before her arrest. She was known for actively borrowing books and was in all-around cheerful spirits. Jane Toppan was indicted on 3 murder charges, but her criminal trial was solely for the killing of Mrs. Gibbs. Her list of proven victims would soon expand to 11. When District Attorney Holmes of Barnstable County met with Harvard Professor Woods, who performed the autopsies on Mrs. Gibbs and Mrs. Harry Gordon. The DA stated on November 2nd that 11 suspicious deaths occurred while Jane was employed at the patients' homes, all of which had further inquiries made. Jane Toppan was also responsible for the deaths of Israel P. Dunham on May 26, 1895, and for his wife on September 19, 1897. It would later be learned that Jane had murdered her adopted sister, Elizabeth, while on vacation with her and her husband in 1899 by poisoning her with strychnine. Then the housekeeper, Florence Calkins, would be murdered by Jane in 1900. There were also Mrs. Connors in 1900, in addition to the entire Davis family. As for who her countless other victims were, Jane Toppan remained tight-lipped. Jane Toppan remained in jail for about 7 months before facing the jury. Her arrest and murder trial would become a worldwide sensation at the time. Jane Toppan was not only headline news in Boston and all over the country, but her story made the news as far as China, New Zealand, and Australia. 3 doctors who specialized in working with mentally ill patients, who were called alienists at this time in psychiatric history, all determined that Jane Toppan was insane during the commission of her crimes. They all believed that, and I quote, the woman was born with a weak and nervous mental condition to a certain extent, and has been suffering and was suffering at the time of the crime from a degenerative form of mental disease, manifested by lack of moral sense and by defective self-control and an irresistible impulse to criminal action. They inserted that this condition existed during the time she committed the murders and still exists in her present mental state. All 3 doctors further insisted that her condition was incurable. During his witness testimony for the defense, Dr. W.H. Lathrop shared with the court Jane Toppan's attempt at suicide and how she had told him how she wanted to die. The trial only lasted around 6 hours, and the jury deliberated for less than 30 minutes before coming to the unanimous decision of a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. The judge sentenced Jane Toppan to Taunton's Insane Asylum for life. She openly admitted to Judge Fred M. Bixby that she had killed at least 21 people, in addition to committing arson and a slew of other crimes. Jane Toppan expressed how she could not stop herself from committing the crimes. She argued with the judge as to how she could be declared of unsound mind when she knew it was wrong to administer poison to her victims, yet she chose to do it. The only reason she did not protest the ruling was that she thought if she was committed to a mental institution for the criminally insane versus prison, she may have the chance of being released. This is a common misunderstanding in the criminal justice system, as research shows that people often spend more than twice the amount of time in an insane asylum, or what would be called a psychiatric facility holding the criminally insane today, versus if the offender had been sentenced to prison. There are some exceptions to this, and violent offenders, even multiple murderers, have been released from these institutions way earlier than they ever would have from a traditional prison. Unfortunately for Jane Toppan, this was not the case, and she was incarcerated at Taunton's Insane Asylum until she died. Her family background, in particular her father's mental health, was used to support the argument that Jane was likely suffering from insanity. However, Jane Toppan and many others declared that she was not insane. Many others, including her brother-in-law, who had somehow survived her toxic clutches, and Dr. W.J. Lathrop, did not believe that Jane was crazy. It was recorded in the asylum that she seemed to be mentally sound. However, over time it damaged her perspective and did not do her any favors in the way of aging. Jane Toppan's years at the asylum wore her down, especially psychologically. She became paranoid that someone was trying to poison her, so she often declined to eat meals. Talk about irony and poetic justice. Jane Toppan died in her early to mid-80s at the Taunton State Hospital on August 22nd, 1938. There is little known history about Jane Toppan's time at the Boston Female Asylum, where she spent 2 important and formative years of her youth. What we do know is that when Mrs. Toppan adopted Honora as an indentured servant and quasi-daughter, and encouraged her to lie about her parents and upbringing to others, this triggered a pattern of perpetual deceit. Ever since that first lie, Jane was known for being a flamboyant liar. She spun ridiculous tales about herself and others and enjoyed causing drama. One of the more interesting lies I read that I found to be quite amusing and very ironic is that Jane Toppan claimed to be so petrified at the sight of a dead body that she became unable to move. She was paralyzed, senseless at the sight. No one knows when Jane Toppan committed her first crime, or even her first murder. Based on her strong manipulative skills, high intelligence, and desire for power and control, I would not be surprised if she had been stealing, and maybe even killed someone years before she entered the nursing profession. Jane Toppan did not suppress her feelings of disgust and unworth she felt toward the elderly. As to why, that is not clear, but she openly told people that they did not deserve to live and should die. How this was not a clear red flag as to how much of a threat she was to vulnerable sick people, and particularly the elderly, is beyond me. I guess no one equated her distasteful expressions to her being capable of committing a malicious act. It seems to me that Jane Toppan desperately wanted power and control over others because she had such little over her own life. Poisoning her patients to the brink of death to bring them back to health with her healing touch, and then poisoning them all over again. It was probably very empowering and thrilling to her. She did not seem at all bothered by murdering helpless people. Her own words indicated that she felt zero remorse or regret about any of her victims, and even expressed how she just couldn't help herself. I think it is fair to say that Jane Toppan's crimes were triggered by abandonment and rejection. This stemmed from her mother's initial abandonment of her as a child when she died, and her father's literal abandonment of her at the asylum. Then she experienced issues of rejection and abandonment by several other people in her life. It has been acknowledged that a possible trigger for her killing people derived from her being betrayed by a young man. Jane, or Jenny as she was called when she was a young woman, had been courted by someone who promised to make her his bride when she was 16. He even gave her a ring in the shape of a bird as his sign of commitment. However, when this same young man traveled out west to find employment, he allegedly fell in love with his landlord's daughter and sent news back to Jenny that he was ending their engagement. Jenny was heartbroken beyond words, and upon hearing this devastating news, destroyed her bird ring. Jane Toppan felt abandoned by her mother, who died when she was so young and vulnerable. She was betrayed by her father, who abandoned her to the asylum to live with strangers. She likely felt betrayed by Mrs. Toppan, who never bothered to properly make her her daughter by adopting her, as she had her foster sister Elizabeth, but rather she just remained her live-in servant. Now, she had been betrayed by the man whom she believed loved her and wanted to build a life with her. It is believed that this betrayal is what made Jane snap. This is when Jane Toppan began her descent into darkness and madness. Then Mrs. Toppan, who was the closest thing she had to a mother and family, wanted her gone. Both of her employers dismissed her. Mr. Brigham, whom she desired, did not return her affection. Rejection and betrayal followed Jane closely, and with each one, she continued to spiral further into her darkness. When Jane Toppan confessed to her murder, she blamed being a serial killer on the fact that she never married. She reportedly said, and I quote, "If I had been a married woman, I probably would not have killed all those people. I would have had my husband, my children, and my home to take up my mind." This expression may be a reflection of how she felt the opportunity to be married and have children, as most people do, was stolen from her when she was rejected and betrayed time and time again. I also think that she was intelligent and manipulative enough to play right into the societal expectations held for her, and how not fulfilling the role of mother and wife led her to madness and to murder. I have difficulty believing that she believed her own words. It is pretty obvious that she thoroughly enjoyed taking the lives of helpless individuals and anyone else who was in her way. Many typologies have been developed to describe the different modus operandi and motivations of the female serial killer. This, of course, is perceived as a template for various kinds of serial killers, and some offenders blend into the typologies. Jane Toppan, whom her patients lovingly referred to as Jolly Jane, was one of these serial offenders whose motivations were triggered by all kinds of emotions. Jane Toppan was labeled as an angel of death since her occupation as a private nurse gave her prime access to the most vulnerable victims. Angels of death are characterized by selecting victims who are under their care in some medical nature or those in child care. They use the environment to their advantage to create a facade of murder as a health tragedy. These serial murderers are driven to kill by power and are enthralled by the life-death game they initiate. This type of serial killer usually becomes too arrogant for their good and has a shorter lifespan of murder than other typologies. Jane Toppan was a female serial killer who crossed over into many typologies. She had a unique typology all of her own. She was driven by heartbreak, greed, issues of betrayal and abandonment, job opportunities, anger, jealousy, and sometimes she murdered out of sheer frustration. Jane Toppan was capable of committing murder for any reason she perceived as being justifiable to her. Whatever or whoever was standing in the way could become prey to her darkness. It was later discovered that while she attended theology school, she eliminated a close girlfriend of hers who stood in her way of being the dining hall matron. Jane wanted this position for herself, so she murdered her friend. In her desire to become the woman of the house, she murdered her foster sister, whom she allegedly had a genuine fondness for. She murdered the Brigham's housekeeper and the sister of her brother-in-law for no other reason except they were standing in the way of her becoming the new mistress of the house. She was also involved in crimes other than homicide. Her penchant for stealing has already been discussed, and she was also an avid arsonist. Jane was directly connected to several unsolved fires. While she was staying with the Davis family, 3 fires broke out mysteriously, although not much of the property was destroyed, nor was anyone hurt. It is not known whether or not she set the house on fire to kill its occupants, or she just wanted to destroy something. During her time at the asylum, a fire broke out at midnight one night, but none of the prisoners were harmed, and nothing was ever found to directly connect her to the crime. The alienists who studied Jane Toppan all believed that she was insane. However, at the time, the term insanity was the only language they had to describe what today would be diagnosed as antisocial personality disorder. Some people may call them psychotic or sociopath. Insanity was merely the only way social scientists of the time could define and attempt to explain the actions of an individual who committed such heinous crimes, especially so many, and in particular by a woman. I don't believe that Jane Toppan was insane in the way that the alienists expressed her to be. She knew exactly what she was doing, was completely aware that her actions were immoral, and claimed that she just couldn't stop because it got her off. Killing innocent, vulnerable, helpless people is what sexually fulfilled Jane Toppan. One of the reasons that female serial killers have been grossly understudied and are rarely discussed is that most serial killers who have been studied have had an element of sexual deviance to their crimes, or this is what was initially believed. Except for women who have participated in sexually driven murders with their dominant male partners, like Mira Henley or Charlene Gallego of the Love Sex Killers. Most women who murder don't do it for sexual gratification. Jane Toppan was an exception to this rule. She was an anomaly to the typical female serial killer, as she admitted that she committed most of her murders to fulfill her sexual fetish. It was recorded how she got sexual pleasure from lying in bed and holding her victims as they convulsed from the poison she administered them. Jane would hold her patients on their beds, her body snuggled up so close to them that she could feel every movement as they slowly died. That is one of the most bizarre and disturbing examples of a sexual fetish I have ever heard of. When Jane Toppan was charged with the murder of Mary Gibbs, she was initially assigned a public defender. However, when she requested that a friend from her childhood, James Stewart Murphy of Lowell, be her attorney, he was fully committed to helping her. Some rumors swirled around his devotion to Jane and his possible affection for her, as he was there for her each step of the way. He was her friend during and after the trial, and even while she was committed to the asylum. It was recorded at the time how Jane had admitted to him that she was not insane at all, and confessed at first to 31 confirmed killings. However, she later confessed that she was not sure how many people she had killed. Between 1888 and 1901, Jane Toppan claimed to have murdered as many as 100 people. If this is true, this makes Jane Toppan one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, if not the most. For comparison, Gary Ridgway, also known as the Green River Killer, confessed to 49, and Samuel Little, who is considered the most prolific serial killer of all time in the United States, confessed to killing 93, although he was only convicted of 8. That is why it makes no sense to me. No pun intended, I find it insane that so many people do not know the story of Jane Toppan or care to know it. I find it fascinating that some people in the true crime community are not interested in historical murders, and even less so in female murderers. This is so strange to me because historical murders involve some of the most brutal, excessive, and depraved murders, not to mention they often feature very compelling perpetrators. They can offer important insight into the setting of the period of history and how time, place, and circumstances affected these offenders and the crimes they committed. It is also critical to the discussion because they expose this facade much of society has regarding how true crime fascination is this modern age thing. Even more unfounded is the notion that violent crimes are a 20th and 21st century problem, triggered by violent media, lack of family, community, traditional values, etc. Now, there are always exceptions, but this kind of thinking in general is a joke, and it is harmful to perceive crime and offenders in such a way. It minimizes the changes and progress that have been made in forensics and social science. True crime has always been extremely popular in society. In some ways, it was considered more normal to be caught up in the gruesome headline news and gossip about morbid killings and insane perpetrators 100 years ago than it is now to binge true crime podcasts or documentaries, at least in some people's eyes. Death and murder have always been a source of fascination to others because it reveals the darkest elements of humanity. When we deny this, we deny that it is worth studying, worth understanding, and worth learning more about. For individuals who can be saved and helped in some way, this is the only way that we as a society can recognize warning signs that could help them and prevent future victims. Is there something that could have prevented 100 people or more from not being brutally, senselessly murdered by this woman? What do you think of Jolly Jane Toppan? Do you believe, as she claimed, if she had been a wife and mother, she would not have committed these murders? Was she a psychopath and she just enjoyed her little nursing game a little too much to stop? It is hard to know if the child Honora could have been saved from becoming the detached, narcissistic serial killer, Jane Toppan. I will leave you with her infamous quote. Jane Toppan claimed her goal in life was to have killed more people, helpless people, than any other man or woman who ever lived. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about this historical female serial killer. Please reach out if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes. Until next time, stay safe and watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets next door, and especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder is created, researched, written, and edited by Alita. Music courtesy of Pixabay by Ashot Danilian.